A black high school valedictorian walked into his Ivy League admissions interview, wearing his best suit, armed with a perfect GPA and fluency in 4 languages. But before he could speak, the white administrator handed him a janitor's badge and said, "Maintenance is in the back." He stood frozen, the rejection letter already printed on the desk, untouched. That's when he noticed his real application was missing, and someone else's name was at the top. What he did next exposed the entire system. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The floors of Harvard's main academic building shimmered like glass, polished to perfection by a man no one truly saw. Elijah Cross had been pushing that same steel-gray janitor's cart for 23 years. Every squeak of its wheels echoed softly against marble floors, a metronome to his quiet existence. To the students in crisp blazers, and professors wrapped in intellectual arrogance, Elijah was simply the help. He existed at the edge of their periphery, present, functional, but invisible. Yet behind those calm brown eyes, a storm of brilliance swirled. Elijah Cross was not merely a janitor. He was a living archive of knowledge, a self-taught linguist who could read, write, and think fluently in 7 languages: English, Spanish, Arabic, Russian, French, Mandarin, and Latin. Each tongue lived in him like a heartbeat. When others dismissed him with casual nods, Elijah was silently translating snippets of their conversations in his mind, measuring tone, grammar, intent. Every night after work, while the rest of the campus buzzed with parties and debate clubs, Elijah sat in a dimly lit apartment filled with secondhand books. The shelves were warped from weight, manuals, dictionaries, and old academic journals salvaged from university dumpsters. A flickering desk lamp illuminated his latest obsession, philosophy of language and semiotics. He traced each word with care, mouthing translations under his breath. Knowledge was his protest, his form of dignity in a world that refused to see him. The irony wasn't lost on him. Harvard, the place that symbolized intelligence, never looked beyond his janitor's uniform to see the mind it was wasting. Once, decades ago, Elijah had applied for an administrative position in the linguistics department. He'd scored higher than any other candidate on the written exam. Yet when the hiring panel saw him in person, dark-skinned, wearing a thrift store suit, they'd politely thanked him and said, "We'll be in touch." They never were. He stopped applying after that. Instead, he stayed mopping, sweeping, listening. He'd realized something profound. When people don't believe you understand them, they reveal everything. Every morning at 5:30, Elijah arrived before dawn. The campus was quiet then. Empty corridors, the faint hum of fluorescent lights, and the smell of wax polish. He liked it that way. It was the only time Harvard felt peaceful, before the footsteps and egos arrived. He'd hum softly as he worked, a tune from his mother's church choir back in Georgia. One winter morning, snow drifted outside the tall Gothic windows. Elijah was cleaning the floor near the Department of Comparative Linguistics when he heard the faint crackle of laughter down the hall. A group of visiting European scholars stood near the faculty lounge, speaking rapidly in Russian. He could tell by the accent, Moscow, maybe St. Petersburg. Their words were sharp, laced with mockery. He paused. His mop stopped mid-swipe. He didn't mean to eavesdrop. It just happened naturally now, like breathing. The black student they admitted this semester, one of them said in Russian. A political gesture, not merit. Laughter followed. Another voice added, they lower the standards, then wonder why excellence suffers. Elijah's stomach tightened. He recognized the name they mentioned next. Caleb Bryant, a bright, hard-working sophomore majoring in linguistics. Elijah had seen him around, polite kid, always greeting him respectfully when others didn't bother. And now, behind closed doors, a room full of scholars mocked him for existing. Elijah's hands gripped the mop handle tighter. The wooden pole creaked. He had spent his life enduring microaggressions, hearing slurs disguised as jokes, being mistaken for maintenance when he was visiting the library as a learner. He'd taught himself patience, the art of invisibility, but something about that conversation, about hearing that ugliness dressed up in intellectual arrogance, made the air taste metallic. He told himself to walk away. Just another day. Just another insult. But his mind was translating every syllable, every sneer. The more they spoke, the clearer it became. They weren't just mocking Caleb. They were mocking the very idea that someone black could belong in their academic world. He looked at the polished floor beneath him, saw his reflection gray uniform, aging face, and a lifetime of restraint. Something inside him shifted. As he turned to leave, one of the scholars said, louder this time, "Imagine if they started letting the janitors take our language exams next." The group burst into laughter. Elijah froze. A strange silence filled him, part fury, part clarity. He'd spent decades swallowing words, letting injustice pass unchallenged. But not this time. Not here. He set the mop aside, walked toward the lounge, and stopped just short of the open doorway. The laughter faded when the scholars noticed him standing there, calm and still. One of them, a tall man with silver hair, smirked. "Ah, the cleaner," he said in English. "Apologies, we didn't mean to disturb your work." Elijah looked at him, then replied, in flawless, unbroken Russian, "No disturbance. I was just wondering, how do you reconcile academic integrity with racial arrogance?" The silence that followed was absolute. The men blinked, startled. One of them whispered something in Russian to another. Did he just? Elijah caught every word. "Yes," Elijah continued, still in Russian. "I understand every insult you just said. Every assumption, every word about that student and about me." No one moved. The tall professor stammered, switching languages out of panic. "You speak Russian?" Elijah gave a slight nod. Then, almost casually, he continued in fluent French, and Arabic, and Mandarin. "Would you prefer I continue?" The group stared, eyes wide, the color draining from their faces. He didn't wait for a response. Instead, he turned, picked up his mop and walked back into the hall, leaving behind the stunned silence of men who'd just realized the man they'd mocked understood everything. He felt his pulse pounding through his wrists. There was no triumph in it, no gloating, just a quiet satisfaction, the kind that comes when truth finally speaks through decades of silence. By the time Elijah returned to his storage room, the entire building seemed to hum differently. Somewhere deep inside, he knew what he had done would not stay hidden for long. Academia thrived on gossip, especially the kind that threatened hierarchy. He leaned against the wall, staring at the mop handle in his hands. That brief exchange had taken less than a minute, but he felt changed, lighter, sharper, as though something ancient in him had finally broken free. A few hours later, while restocking supplies, he noticed heads turning as he passed. Two junior professors whispered in the hallway. Someone pointed discreetly in his direction. The word was spreading faster than he'd imagined. By noon, the faculty lounge was abuzz. Some professors were curious, others amused. A few seemed defensive, as though Elijah's intelligence were a personal affront. He overheard a math lecturer say, "He probably memorized a few phrases. Doesn't mean he's fluent." Elijah said nothing. He continued cleaning, as always, but his movements carried quiet defiance now. Every sweep of his mop was deliberate, controlled. When Dr. William Hargrove, a senior linguistics professor known for his encyclopedic knowledge of languages, heard the story, he dismissed it at first. But something about the rumor intrigued him. He'd been studying Russian dialects for 30 years, and had never once met a janitor who could even pronounce Cyrillic words correctly. Curiosity won over skepticism. That afternoon, as Elijah polished the entranceway near the linguistics wing, Dr. Hargrove approached. "Mr. Cross, may I ask you something?" the professor said kindly. Elijah nodded, cautious. "Is it true you speak Russian?" Elijah looked at him, weighing whether to answer. The hallway felt suddenly narrower, the air denser. Finally, he said quietly, "Yes. Among others." Dr. Hargrove blinked. "Others?" Elijah met his gaze. "6 more." The professor studied him, his steady posture, the calm certainty in his voice. "You're serious," he murmured. Elijah nodded again. "Languages aren't about privilege, sir. They're about listening." Hargrove smiled faintly, half in disbelief. "Then perhaps you'd allow me a demonstration sometime." "Perhaps," Elijah said, returning to his mop. When the professor walked away, Elijah stood still, listening to the echo of his footsteps fade down the hall. He knew this was only the beginning. Harvard wasn't kind to those who defied its unspoken hierarchies. Word would spread, questions would be asked, and the same walls that ignored him for decades would soon turn to watch. But Elijah wasn't afraid anymore. For the first time in years, he felt visible, and visibility was dangerous. Outside, the afternoon sun bled through the stained glass windows, painting the floor in colors that shimmered beneath his mop. The same halls that once swallowed his silence now whispered his name. He didn't know what would come next, praise, ridicule, or punishment. But something irreversible had begun. And as he bent to wring the mop one last time, the faint murmur of voices drifted from the corridor again. This time the language wasn't English. It was Russian, and the words, they weren't just jokes anymore. They were plans. Elijah froze, realizing the men weren't mocking anyone now. They were discussing something secret, something dangerous, and he was the only one who understood every word. The day after Elijah overheard the Russian conversation, the air in the linguistics wing felt heavier, charged with a strange, cautious energy. He sensed eyes lingering a little longer as he pushed his mop across the marble floors, the rubber soles of his boots squeaking softly against the polished stone. Harvard had always been a place of invisible hierarchies, but today those invisible walls seemed to tighten around him. Something had changed. He tried to convince himself that what he heard yesterday didn't matter, that the conversation was just another echo of Harvard's old prejudice, a stain he'd long learned to scrub around. But as he replayed every word in his mind, he realized something new. The Russian voices weren't just gossiping about Caleb Bryant or mocking the presence of a black student. Beneath their cruel humor, there had been a coded rhythm in their speech, phrases that didn't belong in casual conversation. It wasn't just prejudice, it was secrecy. Late that morning, Elijah found himself again near the corridor outside the faculty lounge. Snow still melted on the windowsills, dripping faintly onto the ledge. The same group of scholars, 3 men and 1 woman, stood by the espresso machine, papers in hand, speaking in Russian. Their tone was quieter this time, deliberate. Elijah, wiping a counter nearby, slowed his movements, listening closely. "Tomorrow's delivery will be secured," one of them said in Russian, his accent smoother, from St. Petersburg. The dean's assistant already signed the clearance. "Does anyone suspect?" another asked. "Only the student," the first voice replied. "But he's too naive to understand what he saw." A third voice, deep and impatient, cut in. "If anyone else finds out, we're finished. This time we follow the plan. No improvisations." Elijah's heart quickened. Delivery? Clearance? Plan? He wasn't sure what they meant, but he could tell it wasn't academic. Their tones carried the tightness of risk. For a moment, Elijah wondered if he was misinterpreting. Maybe delivery meant a research shipment. Maybe clearance meant paperwork. But the unease in their voices said otherwise. Years of studying human tone, across 7 languages, had trained him to recognize when words hid danger. He continued cleaning, feigning disinterest. One of the scholars turned and glanced briefly at him, before whispering something that made the others laugh again. "He wouldn't understand a word," said the silver-haired man in English this time, his smirk returning. "Besides, he's just staff." Elijah felt that old sting, the familiar humiliation he'd learned to bury deep. But this time, layered beneath the insult, was something else, an understanding that these people were hiding more than arrogance. He felt a tension in his chest, a choice forming silently inside him: stay invisible, or step into the light and risk everything. The scholars gathered their papers and began walking toward the main exit. Elijah followed them with his eyes, the mop resting still in the bucket. He thought of Caleb, the student they'd mocked, bright, earnest Caleb, who often stayed late in the study hall translating texts on African linguistics, a field most professors dismissed as less rigorous. Elijah had watched that boy fight twice as hard for half the recognition, and now the same group who demeaned him was orchestrating something in secret. At noon, Elijah went to the break room, a narrow space that smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. He sat by the window with his small packed lunch, a peanut butter sandwich, an apple, and a worn paperback of a history of comparative languages. He wasn't hungry. His mind was elsewhere, racing through the Russian words he'd heard: secured, clearance, finished. He translated them back and forth mentally, analyzing syntax, context, tone, anything that could hint at meaning. Then it hit him. One of the words, documenti, had been plural, not singular. They weren't talking about a delivery of goods, but documents, official papers. His pulse quickened again. He had to tell someone, but who would believe him? The janitor who thinks he speaks 7 languages? He could already hear the laughter. Harvard didn't listen to people like him. It listened to titles, degrees, names on plaques. Still, something inside him rebelled against silence. For 20 years he'd swallowed indignities, convincing himself that peace was better than confrontation. But now he was standing at the intersection of injustice and danger. He didn't know what was being planned, but he knew it mattered. That afternoon, he saw Dr. Hargrove again. The professor was standing in the hallway, talking to a young assistant. When their eyes met, Elijah hesitated before speaking. "Professor," he said softly, "may I ask a question?" Hargrove turned, surprised but polite. "Of course." Elijah hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Do you know what kind of research the visiting Russian delegation is conducting?" The professor raised an eyebrow. "Mostly comparative syntax and translation studies, I believe." "Why?" Elijah looked down. "I overheard something that didn't sound academic." The professor frowned. "Not academic?" Elijah took a breath. "They mentioned documents. Clearance. Something about tomorrow." Hargrove studied him for a long moment, trying to gauge if he was serious. "You understood this in Russian?"
Yes.
The professor looked almost amused. "Mr. Cross, you're telling me you understand Russian well enough to interpret academic discussions?" Elijah's jaw tightened. "Yes, sir. Perfectly." There was a pause. The professor softened slightly, his tone no longer patronizing. "If what you heard concerns university property or research, you should report it." "But," he hesitated, "be careful with assumptions. Language is full of nuance." "I know," Elijah said quietly. "It's what I live for." Hargrove gave a faint, puzzled smile before walking away. Elijah was left standing there, his pulse steady but his thoughts racing. That night, he returned home restless. The old radiator hissed beside his chair as he flipped through his Russian-English dictionary, cross-referencing the words he'd heard. His notes filled the margins of scrap paper. The phrase "documenty badut, uverin peradani" stood out. The documents will be securely delivered. By midnight, the realization struck him hard. Those scholars weren't supposed to have those documents. Harvard had strict policies about research data. Any transfer required board approval. If they were sneaking something out, something secured, then they were breaking the law. Elijah stared at the clock. 2:07 a.m. He thought of Caleb again, the student they mocked. He wondered if the secret plan was connected to him, or if he was just another pawn in something larger. The next morning, Elijah arrived early, long before sunrise. The corridors were empty, lit by faint gold light from the chandeliers. He walked quietly past the faculty offices, until he reached the lounge again. The papers the scholars had used the day before were gone, replaced by a sealed envelope on the table. He knew it wasn't his place, but he also knew the university would never take his word without proof. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the envelope, noting the embossed seal, Department of Global Linguistics Confidential. He could feel the weight of it in his palm, heavier than paper should be. Looking for something. The voice behind him froze him in place. It was the silver-haired Russian scholar. His tone was polite but sharp. His English now crisp and deliberate. "I didn't realize janitors had clearance for faculty materials." Elijah turned slowly, setting the envelope down. "Just cleaning, sir." The man stepped closer. "Cleaning?" "Yes." "And listening?" Their eyes locked. Elijah could feel the accusation in his gaze, but also something else, fear. "I clean floors," Elijah said quietly, his voice calm. "What I hear isn't always my choice." The scholar studied him for a long moment, then smiled coldly. "In this place, Mr. Cross, silence is more valuable than knowledge. I hope you remember that." Elijah nodded once, and stepped away, his mind spinning. Silence is more valuable than knowledge. The words rang in his head like a warning. Later that afternoon, when classes ended, Elijah sat on the bench near the courtyard, staring at the snow-covered ground. For years he'd believed invisibility was protection, that staying quiet kept him safe. But now he saw the truth. Silence was complicity. He stood, his decision made. That evening, when the Russian delegation returned to the lounge, Elijah was there again, mopping the floor like any other night. They spoke in Russian, laughing, unaware he was listening. When the silver-haired man repeated another racist joke, this time about Caleb's speech pattern, Elijah finally turned toward them. His voice cut through the laughter like a blade. "Interesting choice of words," he said, in flawless, fluent Russian. "Perhaps you'd care to repeat them in English this time." The room went dead silent. Cups froze mid-air. Papers stopped rustling. One of them blinked. "You speak Russian?" Elijah's expression didn't change. Clearly. He took a step closer, his voice calm but unmistakably sharp. "I've listened to your conversations for days. The jokes, the arrogance, and the secrets. I understand every word. The scholars stared, their faces pale, the weight of realization sinking in. Outside, the hallway began to fill with footsteps, students and professors passing by, unaware of the storm that had just broken inside the lounge. Elijah looked around once, steady and silent. Then he added, still in perfect Russian, "Harvard listens when it wants to, but this time it will listen to me." He walked out, leaving behind stunned faces and shattered pretenses. Within seconds, whispers began racing through the faculty wing about the janitor who spoke 7 languages and the secret he wasn't supposed to understand. Dr. William Hargrove sat in his sunlit office, musing over a stack of dialect essays his graduate students had submitted. The late afternoon light slanted through tall mullioned windows, painting long shadows across oak furniture. He was lost in the soft scratch of pens over margins when a quiet commotion drifted by his doorway. He looked up. The corridor outside was unusually quiet. No student clusters, no laughter, just a single door ajar, and voices he didn't expect. He stood, pushed aside a pen and notebook, and walked toward the threshold. From just beyond the door, he heard Russian clear, unmistakable, his brow furrowed. Those weren't the voices of any visiting scholar he recognized. He stepped further into the hallway. He knew every accent in that wing. This voice was authoritative, confident, crisp. It paused, and then in Mandarin it asked a question he only half caught. Then Arabic. Then softly French. He froze. This wasn't a European professor correcting a visiting student. This was someone moving with facility across languages he himself had studied for decades. He stepped forward, nudging the door open, gently. There, in the dim hallway light, was Elijah Cross, the janitor, mop propped in the bucket, sleeves rolled back, eyes calm and direct, and facing him were the Russian delegation, stunned, speechless. "Please repeat your question," Elijah said, in Mandarin. "Flawless." One of the delegation members stuttered, recovering, but Elijah switched immediately into Arabic, then French. Hargrove's breath caught. He had to see it with his own ears. He stepped fully into the room. "Elijah Cross?" Hargrove said, his voice quiet but firm. The room turned toward him. Elijah gave a small nod. Hargrove cleared his throat. "Would you kindly or pожалуйста repeat your Russian statement?" Elijah turned back to the stunned delegation. With composure he repeated the same phrase in flawless Russian, then rephrased it in French with subtle idiomatic changes, then Mandarin, and then even switched to Arabic. One by one, those men and women recognized that this was not mimicry. This was native-level command. After a long moment of silence, Hargrove exhaled. He felt as though the floor had shifted beneath him. For decades he'd lectured students on syntax rules, diglossia, phoneme shifts, but he had never once heard a cleaner or janitor deliver a code-switched performance like this. He took a step forward. That was extraordinary, truly. One of the delegation scholars, face pale, stammered. We thought." Hargrove raised his hand. "Let me hear you say it in English." The scholar, not sure whether under pressure or shame, translated roughly. "We asked about your delivery of the research documents, whether the dean's assistant had cleared them." Hargrove's mind raced. Research documents. Clearance. This dovetailed with what Elijah had claimed to overhear. He turned to Elijah. Heart pounding. I had no idea. This is far beyond what I'd expected." Elijah's expression was calm, tempered, not proud, but firm. "I speak all of those languages, sir." "I have for some time." Hargrove swallowed. Something in him recognized the tremor in his own worldview. The man before him, who polished floors, passed by with nary a glance, was not who he thought. The delegation stood frozen, exchanging glances. One of them cleared her throat. "If you don't mind, Professor, we might need to discuss this later." Hargrove nodded, though his mind went a mile a minute. As the delegation retreated, he turned back to Elijah. The corridor seemed emptier now, as if the walls themselves held their breath. "Elijah," he said quietly, "I would very much like to hear more. In my office." Elijah nodded, setting the mop aside. The professor motioned him in. The hallway light dimmed as they passed the doorway threshold. Once inside, Hargrove closed the door behind them. He gestured to a chair, but Elijah stood. He watched the professor pace, collecting his thoughts. The walls were lined with language maps, phonetic charts, framed diplomas, all polished, ordered, all of it about classification, taxonomy, separation, and now at its threshold stood an anomaly that threatened it. Hargrove paused, looked at Elijah directly. "Why did you stay silent until now?" Elijah's voice was quiet but firm. "Because silence protected me. It let me live beneath the radar. But I can't stay beneath when secrets are being moved behind closed doors. I can't idle when I understand them." Hargrove's eyes flicked toward the file drawer behind him. The old envelopes, labeled research protocols, sat in a neat stack. He realized suddenly that even his own shelves might conceal truths he hadn't known. He cleared his throat. "If what you told me is true, if those documents are being transferred covertly, then we're looking at institutional misconduct." Elijah nodded. "Yes, that's what I believe." Hargrove's mind sketched possibilities. Leaks, theft, academic espionage, discrediting other scholars. Each was more audacious than the last. This was no longer a linguistic marvel. This was risk beyond any syllabus. He moved to a small desk, pulled out a pen and said, "I'd like to record what you know, and I want your permission to approach the dean, but only when we have proof." Elijah watched him silently. Then, unexpectedly, he said, "Professor, there is something else." Hargrove looked up, wary but curious. "In the break room this morning," Elijah continued, "I found an envelope on the table. Department of Global Linguistics, confidential." I picked it up. The embossing matched one I had seen last night in my notes. I was about to open it, but someone was coming. I tucked it inside my jacket. Hargrove's eyes widened. He walked over to his bookshelf and removed a thin folder. He flipped it open. "This is similar to what you describe." Elijah nodded. "I believe those documents are among the ones being referenced. I heard them mention clearance and delivery. I think what they're moving involves that envelope, or more like it." At that moment, a soft knock sounded on the door. Hargrove froze. Elijah tensed beside him. The knock came again, firm. Hargrove held up a finger and walked toward the door, glancing over his shoulder at Elijah. "One moment," he said quietly. He opened the door a crack. In the threshold stood the dean's assistant, pallid, stiff-lipped, holding a sealed letter. She cleared her throat. "Professor Hargrove, the dean would like to see you immediately. He's heard interesting rumors." Hargrove's face turned a shade paler. He turned to Elijah. "Stay here." The assistant hesitated, then said under her breath, "They say the janitor spoke Russian, flawless. The faculty wing is buzzing." Hargrove's jaw tightened. He held the door half open, listening. The assistant handed him the letter. He glanced. The envelope bore the university seal. "Very well," he finally said, closing the door behind her. He turned to Elijah. "We'll go together." Elijah braced himself, quiet resolve in his posture. But before they left, Elijah placed a hand gently on the envelope in Hargrove's hand, as though letting him know he wasn't powerless. As they exited the office, passing into the hallway now humming with whispers, Hargrove looked down at Elijah with a mix of awe and uncertainty. And then in the crowd gathered near the faculty lounge, someone whispered out loud, "It's him." Hargrove's heart skipped. He realized that the secret they had uncovered was no longer hidden. Someone had already identified Elijah. They walked side by side, toward what neither fully understood. As the door to the dean's suite loomed ahead, Elijah's mind raced. He realized something no one else yet knew. The envelope Hargrove held might already be a trap. The next morning, whispers trailed Elijah like invisible footsteps. On corridors, in the stairwells, behind closed doors, his name circulated before he even entered the faculty wings. The rumor, once a shock, now seemed to have life of its own. Some voices spoke in admiration. More voices murmured suspicion, resentment, and thinly veiled racism. In the faculty lounge just after 10 a.m., the usual hum of conversation dropped to low murmurs. When Elijah passed by with his cleaning cart, professors lifted their heads, glanced, then lowered them quickly, as though embarrassed. Soft murmurs floated across half-full coffee cups. "That janitor claim is absurd," one senior professor with a stiff collar muttered to his colleague. "Probably a gimmick, a publicity stunt. Wouldn't surprise me if it's fake," replied another voice. "They love these narratives now, elevation stories to score diversity points." A third voice leaning in from the next table added, "He's been here 20 years, where was this talent before?" Convenient timing. Elijah, pushing the cart slowly, felt eyes slicing his back. He didn't pause or look over his shoulder. He had learned long ago to carry silence like armor. Across the lounge, Dr. Hargrove stood by a bulletin board. watching interactions. He caught phrases: janitor experiment, token inclusion, scene stealer. He felt a tight knot in his throat. The hostility was real, immediate, and insidious. When a young assistant professor, newly tenured and eager to prove loyalty, stood to leave and nearly bumped into Elijah, she glanced at him awkwardly and murmured, "Sorry, I didn't see you." Elijah nodded without acknowledgement. The apology felt hollow. The department chair, Dr. Rebecca Lansing, entered shortly afterward, a commanding presence. She moved with measured authority. She paused at the lounge threshold, her sharp eyes scanning the room. The chatter stilled momentarily. People pretended to study their notes. Lansing's lips curved into a polite, neutral smile as she crossed past Hargrove to the coffee urn. She poured herself a cup, slow and considered. She was cautious, aware of the tensions that had burst into campus news the prior evening. She knew that how she handled this moment would define her leadership. As she sipped, overhearing a snippet, "He cleans floors, not minds," she turned sharply. The speaker, a mid-level professor, flushed. Lansing's eyes flicked to Hargrove, then to Elijah. In the quiet that followed, she simply said, "We have a private departmental meeting in 30 minutes. You all know the room. Attendance is mandatory." Then she left, walking past Elijah with a nod so slight most missed it. Whispers resumed immediately, but now with a sharper edge. Some professors dropped their glasses, some straightened their ties. Eyes darted to the doorway. Phones were subtly brought up. Hargrove caught Lansing's shadow crossing into her office. Minutes later, as Elijah cleaned the polished floor near the lounge entrance, an assistant in the linguistics department approached, her steps hesitant. She lowered her voice, but made sure he heard. "Mr. Cross," she said softly, "Dr. Lansing asked that you attend the meeting in half an hour." In her office, Elijah paused. His mop paused mid-sweep. The edge in her voice suggested it wasn't optional. He nodded curtly. "I'll be there." The assistant's relief was visible. She recovered and stepped away. He resumed cleaning, but each sweep felt deliberate now, measured. He had anticipated rumors and whispers, but not formal summons. Why would the department chair personally call him to a closed-door meeting? Across the lounge, Hargrove watched Elijah receive the instruction. He met Lansing's eye from across the room. She glanced away. He walked toward Elijah quietly, weaving between tables. "Elijah," he said under his breath, "please be cautious. I'll try to join you." Elijah nodded. "Thank you, Professor." Hargrove gave a brief, tense smile and retreated. He couldn't risk appearing too aligned. He had his own reputation to protect. The meeting room lay beyond a long corridor, framed by double doors etched with the department seal. As Elijah walked up, heads turned. The silver-haired Russian scholar was already there, standing near Lansing's desk, expression cool and unreadable. Other faculty members filed in, some with forced calm, others with open hostility in their eyes. Lansing stood at the head of the room, arms folded. She addressed them all quietly, but firmly. "Thank you for coming," she said. "We are here because recent events have raised questions about reputation, protocol, and the integrity of our scholarship." Her eyes landed on Elijah. "Mr. Cross, thank you for agreeing to attend." He stepped forward. The room's murmurs subdued immediately. Chairs scraped. Lansing waved him in. She cleared her throat. "First, let me say, if any of you harbor ill will or envy, that is not the kind of environment this department promotes." Sculpted words, but tension hung in the air. She paused. "Second, I want to hear from Mr. Cross what he claims to know." But before that, she cut off, looked at Hargrove. "Professor, would you brief the committee?" Hargrove's throat tightened, but he complied. He summarized the rumor reports, careful not to accuse. Mr. Cross claims observational knowledge, overheard conversations, a sealed envelope, references to clearance and documents. He says these suggest covert actions exceeding academic norms. Some faculty snorted. One older professor leaned back, arms crossed. "Sounds speculative. Anyone can overhear a phrase and dramatize it." Another chimed in. "We all heard him claim he speaks 7 languages. Too many for a university janitor. It's theatrical, maybe sensationalist." Elijah's face remained composed, but inside his mind words burned. He was used to prejudice in layers. Now the insulation was gone. He felt exposed, naked, in a room of judgment. Lansing raised her hand, silencing the room. "All right, Mr. Cross, if you wish to speak, Tell us what you heard and why you believe it matters. He inhaled slowly, glancing at Hargrove. The professor nodded encouragingly. Elijah began. In the hallway outside this lounge, I overheard the visiting scholars speaking Russian. Their tone wasn't casual mocking. They discussed securing documents, obtaining clearance, an upcoming delivery. I traced the phrasing, compared it to literal translations, and believe those words correspond to institutional documents, not authorized for off-site transfer. I found a sealed envelope earlier, labeled Department of Global Linguistics Confidential. I believe that may be one of the documents referenced. He paused. A few faces looked away. The silver-haired man's jaw clenched. Lansing remained impassive. Then Elijah dropped an unexpected detail. I also discovered that 2 nights ago, the lock on the department archive room was tampered with. The keypad log shows an override access between 2 gasps hummed. That was something no one had known, probably because the integrity logs were internal. The implication, someone was accessing highly sensitive files covertly. Lansing's eyebrow rose. She glanced at Hargrove, then back at Elijah. Where did you get that log data? Elijah's voice remained even. I did not access the log. I saw the override entry as I passed the console after my shift. Lights were off. No one should have been there. A ripple of tension spread through the room. The professor who had mocked him earlier frowned. Hargrove looked stunned. Lansing's lips thinned. One faculty member whispered, "That's serious." Another added, "This is more than a rumor now. This is potentially criminal." Lansing's face hardened. She tapped her finger on her desk. "I will bring this to the dean." She turned to Elijah. "Mr. Cross, until further notice, your access to departmental offices will be restricted. You will not be allowed into the archive area." Some heads nodded. Others stifled frustration. The Russian scholar watched silently, expression unreadable. Elijah remained still. "I understand," Lansing continued. "We will review evidence. You may be asked to provide translations or testimony as needed. But this meeting is adjourned for now." As chairs creaked and legs swept across floor, people filed out grudgingly. Lansing moved to shake hands with Hargrove, offering polite words. But before he could exit, she turned and motioned quietly to Elijah. He froze, invitation or threat. Lansing's tone was soft. "Mr. Cross, once we have senior approval, I will need you in my office for a brief discussion." He nodded. No promise, no complaint. As he left the meeting room, stepping into the corridor, the silver-haired scholar hovered in the doorframe. He locked eyes with Elijah, then whispered, barely audible, "You overstepped." Elijah's steps faltered. Inside, flames of fury and resolve surged. Outside the door, the corridor felt cold again, as though the building recoiled from what had transpired. Hargrove approached him. "Do not be discouraged," he said low. "You have shaken foundations. That's never comfortable." Elijah nodded. He adjusted his jacket, feeling the sealed envelope's weight in his pocket. In the distance, he saw Lansing's office door close firmly. Behind its walls, decisions would be made that could change his life forever. As Elijah pushed open the larger doors back into the lounge, he saw a circle of faculty staring at him. In the center of that circle stood Dr. Lansing, holding a printed memo with his name. She raised her head and asked in a calm but cutting voice, "Miss Cross, do you know why I've just revoked your janitorial contract?" The next morning, Elijah arrived at Harvard not with a mop, but with a folder under his arm. His uniform, a crisp navy button-up, and pressed slacks, looked nothing like what the faculty expected. His ID badge still said facilities, but everyone in the building knew that wasn't how the story would read anymore. By the time he reached the linguistics wing, whispers had already returned. A crowd had begun to form outside room 302, normally reserved for small departmental presentations. Today it was charged with a quiet electricity. Inside, the air was cold, not because of the temperature but because of the tension. The round table the department had arranged was anything but friendly. Though it had been pitched to Elijah as a chance to share your skills, the truth was evident in the seating arrangement. 6 senior faculty members at one side of a long conference table, Elijah alone on the other. The remaining chairs filled slowly with observers, graduate students, junior lecturers, even campus media under the guise of academic journalism. Dr. Rebecca Lansing sat at the center, her expression polished but distant. She tapped her pen twice on her notepad. "Let the record reflect that this meeting is informal, but necessary. Mr. Cross has made claims, public and private, regarding his language proficiency. This session is an opportunity to evaluate those claims for the integrity of the department. There was no welcome. No thank you for attending. Just the word claims hanging like a verdict. Dr. Hargrove sat at the far end, quiet, his face unreadable. He had tried to intervene before the session, suggesting a more private meeting, or at least a fairer format. But Lansing had insisted transparency, she claimed. The truth. They wanted Elijah to falter in front of witnesses. The first question came quickly, delivered by Professor Alden, an expert in historical linguistics. He leaned forward with a faint smirk. Mr. Cross, could you translate this 12th century Latin passage? He slid a printed page across the table. Elijah read it, his brow furrowing briefly, then responded, first in translated English, then in spoken Latin, accent correct, rhythm natural. He even noted 2 minor errors in the printed text. Murmurs fluttered across the room. Another professor spoke up, this time in fluent French. Elijah replied without pause, shifting smoothly between dialects. Metropolitan French, then West African French. He explained the phonetic and syntactical differences. As he did so, a woman to the left, Professor Tyra, from the Japanese Studies Department, offered a phrase in formal Japanese. Elijah matched it with ease, adding historical context, noting how the phrasing originated in Kyoto poetry. Then came Sanskrit. Elijah's tone deepened, his cadence almost reverent. The room quieted. Some students leaned in, visibly stunned. He moved through Swahili like it was his native tongue, his inflection precise. Then back to French. Then Arabic. With each shift, doubt peeled away from the faces in the room. Until now, most had believed the rumors were exaggerated, that Elijah was performing party tricks. But this was mastery. Still, Lansing pressed on. Do you hold any formal certification for these languages? She asked, voice flat. No, Elijah said calmly. I studied them privately. Her eyebrow lifted. With what resources? Elijah replied without flinching. Discarded textbooks, library materials, audio cassettes. I worked night shifts for 20 years and studied between them. Every day, every night, I committed myself to what Harvard locked me out of. The lines struck the room like a tuning fork. Hargrove's gaze flicked toward Lansing, who didn't flinch but clearly noted the shift in tone. There was a beat of silence, then a chair scraped at the back of the room. A man stood. He wore a tailored gray suit, his accent crisp European, Belgian or Dutch, his badge read, Dr. Felix Lemons, visiting scholar, Ghent University. I would like to ask a question, he said. Lansing nodded. Dr. Lemons turned to Elijah. In the early 2000s, I attended a private symposium in Brussels. A speaker there, anonymous at the time, delivered a comparative analysis on tonal patterns in Swahili and ancient Tamil. No one knew who he was. The lecture was unpublished, but I never forgot it. He stepped closer. Your phrasing just now, your structural explanation, was nearly identical to that anonymous lecture. I must ask, where did you study? The room quieted, eyes turned. Some professors leaned in. Elijah's face remained calm, but his eyes flicked toward Hargrove, then Lansing. I've never been to Brussels, Elijah replied softly, but I did write that paper. I mailed it anonymously to the symposium, after it was rejected by Harvard's internal review. The feedback said my credentials were not consistent with the profile of an author in this field. Gasps filled the room. Lemons blinked, stunned. You're saying the janitor wrote the paper we cited for 6 years? Elijah's reply was quiet, but razor sharp.
Yes, the janitor.
A long silence settled. The weight of what had just been revealed pressed down on the room like gravity. Lansing looked visibly uncomfortable now. Her pen paused mid-air. She didn't write anything. No one did. Hargrove stood slowly. His voice was calm. This department prides itself on rigor, on intellect, on truth. If a man speaks 9 languages, translates in real time, and has work cited in academic papers, even unknowingly, how is he not worthy of recognition? Lansing didn't answer. But her eyes told the story. Professor Alden, previously smirking, now leaned back stiffly. What are we supposed to do with this? He muttered. Lemon spoke again. I believe Mr. Cross has something this university forgot, how to value. Brilliance born outside of privilege. Whispers. Footsteps in the hallway. Outside the door, more students had gathered. Word was spreading again. Elijah stepped forward gently. I never asked to be here. I never begged for titles. I simply wanted to learn in a place that told me I wasn't allowed to. Now that I've been heard, I ask only that others like me won't have to stay silent for decades. It wasn't a speech. It was a wound laid open. No one moved. No one dared. Then Lansing stood, finally. This is not an official hiring committee. No decisions will be made here. But this department will review all relevant materials, including past submissions. It was bureaucratic language, but everyone heard the message. She had been cornered. Still, as the room began to empty, quiet shaken, she pulled aside an assistant and whispered sharply. Her lips tightened. Elijah couldn't hear the words, but the energy was familiar. Retreat, recalibrate, retaliate. As the last professors filtered out, Lemon stopped Elijah. Would you consider publishing formally? He asked. Under your name this time? Elijah looked at the man. Earnest. Humbled. Maybe. If someone's willing to read past the cover. They shook hands. Back in the hallway, Hargrove joined Elijah. You did more than prove yourself, he said. You redefined the test. Elijah gave a faint smile. Funny. All it took was 20 years, 9 languages, and a room full of skeptics. They walked side by side, past curious students and wide-eyed staff. But before they reached the stairwell, a tall woman blocked their path, an administrator from the president's office, wearing an expression colder than the marble beneath their feet. She held a folder. Mr. Cross, she said evenly. The president would like a word. Now. As Elijah reached for the folder, a small logo on the front caught his eye, not from Harvard, but from the Department of Homeland Security. Something far bigger than academic politics had just entered the room. Elijah stood in the hallway outside the president's suite, clutching the folder stamped with Department of Homeland Security as though it were a shield. Behind him, Hargrove lowered his voice. We move carefully now. What you reveal next matters more than anything so far. Elijah nodded. The weight of 2 decades' hidden ambition pressed on his chest. He inhaled deeply. Then he stepped forward. The assistant from the president's office had already cracked open the door and gestured them in. The room was broader than he expected. Glass walls, polished wood, certificates and plaques lining the far corner. The president's executive team, dean, legal counsel, PR director, sat around a table, their expressions unreadable. The woman who'd summoned them, the president's chief of staff, rose. She offered a brief, tight smile. Thank you for coming, Dr. Hargrove. Mr. Cross. We have questions. But it wasn't questions they meant. It was judgments, decisions, power. Elijah shut out the glare of cameras he felt behind glass partitions. He let Hargrove speak first, summarizing the round table, the leak of the envelope, the tampered archive logs. He pointed toward Lansing's memo, then the DHS folder. Faces shifted. The president, a tall man with silvering hair, sat quietly, listening. When the silence deepened, Elijah began, gentle but unflinching, tone deliberately calm. He recounted his story, as though reading from a book no one had asked him to write. I never enrolled in college, he said. I applied 3 times. Harvard was one. I had perfect test scores, glowing faculty recommendations. The essays they accepted none. On paper, I should have been obvious. In practice, I was invisible. His voice caught briefly. He steadied. After my mother died, I had to work. I took 2 jobs, night custodial shifts, day delivery. Books became my refuge. Libraries, dumpsters behind academic buildings, discarded volumes. I taught myself languages, while the rest of the campus slept. Every night, while the world rested, I translated, memorized, compared syntax, immersion audio, borrowed interlibrary loans. All quietly. A lean woman, legal counsel, no doubt, leaned forward, pen poised but motionless. The PR director's jaw flickered. No one interrupted. He continued. I lived dividing life into minutes, working hours, study hours, rest rare. Every rejection I received, I filed internally. No space left. Candidate from local community, underrepresented applicant, all polite rejections. But I knew I'd qualified. The president's face softened slightly, a faint empathy, but masked by protocol. I came here as janitor because it was this institution I wanted to belong to. Even if only as anonymous labor. I wanted proximity, so that someday, if I spoke, I might be heard. His words echoed. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air thicker. Then came the twist. No one saw, on the horizon. He paused, then said, Dr. Hargrove is not the first professor I trusted with truth. Years ago, when I first applied to Harvard, I sent an advanced linguistics essay under a pseudonym to your faculty. He looked directly at the president. I mailed it under another name. It won praise. It was used in a graduate seminar, without credit. I never revealed who I was, but that work lives in your curriculum. Gasps. Shocked looks. The legal counsel rose and exclaimed, That's academic fraud, if true. The president raised a hand to silence her. Elijah pressed on. I was testing the system I knew would silence me. I watched what arguments succeeded. I watched who got published and who got status. I saw doors open, only to people with pedigrees. I navigated behind the scenes, but I never revealed until I had evidence. The room shut down. No one spoke for a long moment. The president pinched the bridge of his nose. Then Hargrove spoke, voice low. He has more validity than many standalone scholars in this room. Then, the unexpected radical turn came. The chief of staff cleared her throat. She turned to Lansing via a video monitor that had begun streaming the earlier meeting. Lansing's face blinked on screen. In that moment, Dr. Hargrove proposed in full view of every executive, every camera, every silent observer. I propose Harvard create an honorary professorship for Mr. Elijah Cross. No faculty requirement, but full access to research, mentoring, institutional resources. Let him teach as he wants. Let him publish under his name. Let it be Harvard's statement that genius isn't defined by title. The room froze. The silence that followed sounded like a verdict. Lansing appeared on the screen, face stony. She spoke into the camera. I object. This undermines the merit system we've long held. What message does this send? But Hargrove didn't waver. He looked back into the glass wall where students and staff watched the scene play out in hidden chambers. The message, he said, is that merit is not a club restricted to pedigree. It's earned daily. And this man earned it. The president leaned forward. He glanced at the legal counsel, then at the PR director, then back at Elijah. In that moment, chaos erupted. The PR director's phone buzzed. The legal counsel frowned. Lansing's face contorted with anger. The president looked at Elijah and said, Carefully, Mr. Cross, do you accept this honor if offered? And if you do, will you respect institutional protocols and boundaries? Elijah paused. If he accepted, he stepped into a system that had long excluded him. If he declined, he risked losing credibility. His heart pounded. His mind raced through every possible repercussion. Hargrove glanced at him, expectant. Elijah nodded once. Yes, I accept. In that instant, Lansing's visage on the screen broke. She banged her hand onto her desk, her face twisting. You will regret this, she hissed. But no one responded. The room hung on Elijah's quiet yes. Outside the president's suite, through the glass, students and staff whispered. Through the building's corridors, the word would echo. Honorary position, institutional acknowledgement, change. As Elijah walked out alongside Hargrove, the DHS folder still in his hand, the glass walls separated him from observers. But his presence now filled the space. And just as he stepped into the corridor, Lansing's voice crackled over the speaker system. Effective immediately, we revoke Mr. Cross's security clearance until further evaluation. Elijah's stomach dropped. As the glass doors slid shut behind him, Elijah looked down at the DHS folder again and realized the seal inside was not Harvard's. The ink on Elijah's honorary position was barely dry when the backlash began. It started with silence, quiet looks in the hallways, sudden stops in conversation when he entered a room, smiles that didn't reach the eyes. But then the whispers hardened into something sharper, less subtle. Within 24 hours of the announcement, emails flooded the department listserv. Some came from tenured faculty, others from alumni, and anonymous addresses. All carried a familiar stench. Indignation masked as concern. Racism cloaked in academic phrasing. The standards of our institution are being compromised. It sets a dangerous precedent to reward an uncredentialed staffer with such visibility. This is nothing more than an emotional stunt. It undermines every academic who earned their position. One email, bolder than the rest, read, He cleans floors, he doesn't shape minds. Elijah saw none of the emails directly, but he felt their effects. By the next morning, His keycard wouldn't open the main elevator to the faculty offices. He assumed it was a glitch. When he called facilities, they responded curtly. Restricted access until further notice. No explanation. That afternoon, he went to clock in for his usual custodial shift. Except his name was no longer on the assignment board. A student intern, flustered and confused, handed him a reassignment slip that read, Secondary Maintenance, Off-Campus Storage Unit. It was the lowest priority assignment in the system, typically reserved for part-time temps or probationary hires. He stared at the paper. No one had said anything to his face. But the message was unmistakable. Behind the honorary title, Harvard was still Harvard. When Hargrove learned of the changes, he stormed into the dean's office without knocking. His voice, normally composed, trembled with rage. "You're retaliating," he said flatly. "You gave him a position, then started pulling strings to silence him." The dean, a well-groomed man in a tight navy suit, folded his hands. "No one's silencing anyone. This is about institutional order. The backlash is real, William. Faculty are threatening to withhold research. Alumni are questioning donations. We must balance the optics." "Optics?" Hargrove snapped. "He's not a stunt. He's a scholar. He's not a professor. He's more a professor than half the department." The dean's eyes narrowed. "Watch your tone." "I won't. Because you know what this is." Hargrove leaned forward. "It's gatekeeping. It's racism. And you're hoping the pressure forces him to walk away." But Elijah didn't walk away. He showed up every day, even when his hours were slashed, even when his mop and bucket were replaced with an outdated vacuum that barely worked. He smiled when students greeted him, nodded politely when faculty members ignored him. But inside, something was unraveling. The building he once admired now watched him with narrowed eyes. His honorary title didn't come with an office, or a desk, or a department mailbox. Just his name on a campus-wide memo that most had already chosen to forget. One afternoon, Elijah stopped by the language lab he once cleaned every Thursday. A place where he used to listen quietly to students practicing pronunciation drills. Now, the door required fingerprint access. He pressed his hand to the pad. Access denied. He stood there for a moment, uncertain whether to laugh or scream. Behind the glass, students moved about, unaware of the man standing inches from the place where he once polished the floor while mentally decoding obscure dialects. That night, he sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by stacked boxes of books, his old notebooks filled with scribbled translations, phonetic trees, and historical references, lay open like lifelines. He reread a page from 2003, where he'd broken down an ancient Swahili poem line by line. The annotations were more detailed than any grad-level thesis he'd seen. But now he was being told again that it wasn't enough. The next day, a message arrived in his inbox from an unfamiliar name, Jada Monroe. Subject line: Interview request. Harvard janitor story. Elijah hesitated. Clicked it open. "Mr. Cross, I'm a sophomore journalism student, working for the Crimson Files, the independent campus news site. I've been following your story since the roundtable. What's happening to you now? It matters. May I speak with you off record if needed? You deserve to be heard fully, not just tokenized. Beth." Jada. Elijah blinked at the screen. He read the message twice. It was the first time anyone had used the word deserve. They met that evening in a quiet cafe near Harvard Square. Jada arrived early, carrying a recorder, a notepad, and eyes full of purpose. "I just want the truth," she said. And Elijah gave it to her. He didn't embellish. He didn't dramatize. He simply walked her through the rejections, the silent years, the languages, the papers he'd ghostwritten, the erasure, the applause that quickly turned to suspicion once people learned who he really was. Jada listened without interrupting. She asked hard questions, but not out of doubt, out of integrity. What hurt more, she finally asked, being invisible for 20 years, or being seen and then immediately punished for it? Elijah looked down at his hands. "Being seen," he whispered. "Because for a moment I believed I mattered, and then the system reminded me I didn't." Jada's article dropped 3 days later. It wasn't published in the official student newspaper. Harvard wouldn't touch it. But the Crimson Files had no gatekeepers, and what Jada wrote shook the institution from the inside out. The man Harvard wants to hide, how a black janitor outsmarted the system, and got burned for it. The headline was bold. The story sharper. She named the departments, coded the emails, leaked to her anonymously by a sympathetic TA. She included photos, Elijah speaking at the round table, standing outside the lab that now barred him entry. The memo restricting his access. The story went viral overnight. On Twitter, students raged. Alumni demanded answers. Local news picked it up. Then national outlets. Honor Elijah trended for 2 days straight. But Harvard's response was muted. Calculated. A brief statement citing ongoing internal review, miscommunication, and respect for diversity. No apology, no reinstatement, no accountability. Inside the university, faculty splintered into factions, some calling for Elijah's full appointment, others doubling down. Anonymous letters began appearing in Elijah's locker. One read, "You don't belong here. You never will." Another, printed in bold red font, simply said, "Mop floors. Stay quiet." Elijah didn't flinch. He'd seen worse. He kept coming. But the message was clear. Harvard wasn't ready for what he represented. Still, not everyone agreed. A week after the article dropped, Elijah received an envelope slipped under his apartment door. No return address. Just a note written in pen. "They fear what they can't control. But the students believe you. Some faculty do too. Keep showing up. You are the lesson now." Inside the envelope was a campus map with a small circle drawn around a basement seminar room. Tuesday, 6 p.m. Elijah stared at it, heart pounding. He arrived at the room unsure what to expect, and found it packed wall to wall with students waiting in silence. In front, a whiteboard with one message scrawled in red ink: "Teach us." It started with one upload, a midnight post by Jada Monroe on the Crimson Files, written with a clarity that sliced through institutional fog like glass. She titled it simply,
"The Polyglot Janitor of Harvard."
No clickbait. No sensationalist jargon. Just 6,000 words of unapologetic truth, threaded with screenshots, quotes, and a truth Harvard had failed to contain. At 7:14 a.m., the first few students shared it in private group chats. By 8:02 a.m., it was on the front page of Reddit's Our Education. By 9:30, a TikTok stitched together stills of Elijah speaking Swahili, Latin, Arabic, with the caption, "They mocked him. Now he's teaching them." That video crossed 1.2 million views before noon. The impact wasn't immediate. It was explosive. Inside Harvard's glossy walls, the shift was unmistakable. Students read the article in lecture halls, nodding quietly to themselves. Professors scrolled on iPads with tight lips and widened eyes. Staff, once silent in passing, began offering Elijah small nods of recognition, as if acknowledging him for the first time. But it wasn't just Harvard anymore. BuzzFeed Education picked it up. Then The Atlantic. Then NPR. The New York Times wrote a feature titled, "Uncredentialed Genius or Institutional Threat." The headline straddled neutrality, but the piece quoted the story in full. The article carried an image of Elijah walking the halls, his old janitor's badge clipped to his chest, and paired it with a line that would echo across social platforms for weeks. He mopped the floors where his genius was ignored. By midday, Elijah's phone buzzed nonstop. He had no publicist, no agent, no blueprint for handling national attention. But the world had decided he was no longer invisible. He sat in the small seminar room, his unofficial classroom now still processing what had happened the night before. 43 students had shown up. No credit, no grades, no institutional sanction, just chairs, notebooks, and the single red phrase on the board, "Teach us." And he did. He walked them through tonal dissonance in Arabic dialects. He explained linguistic drift in Swahili, code-switching patterns among African American communities, and the erased contributions of non-European languages in academic canon. His voice didn't thunder. It didn't need to. His presence carried the weight of earned wisdom, not borrowed authority. That morning, as he poured coffee from an old thermos, Hargrove entered the room and stood quietly at the back. No announcement. Just silent support. The students noticed. After class, Elijah walked across Harvard Yard. The sky was clear, but something in the air had shifted. He saw students filming short clips, TikToks and documentaries in the making. 2 undergrads whispered as he passed,
"That's him."
"I saw him speak Arabic in that video. Did you hear what he said about the Latin translations?" He kept walking, not out of arrogance, but necessity. Fame wasn't his goal. It never had been. But visibility, finally being seen, was a weight he was learning to carry. By late afternoon, his inbox was full. Invitations to lecture, podcast requests, foreign universities asking if he'd speak via Zoom. One email stood out. Subject: National Interview Request. CBS Sunday Spotlight. It was real. Signed by a senior producer. They wanted to film him in Harvard Yard. Full sit-down. Primetime segment. He read it 3 times. Hargrove sat with him on a bench outside Widener Library. Later that day, students trickled past, some waving, others nodding quietly. The sun dipped low behind the trees, casting golden light across the steps. "Are you going to do it?" Hargrove asked. Elijah looked at the phone again. "I don't know," he said. "They want a headline, a face." "You are the headline," Hargrove said gently. "But you don't have to be the caricature. You speak for yourself. That's what scares them." Elijah stared at the cobblestone beneath his shoes. "What scares me is how fast this has all moved. 2 weeks ago, I was mopping that corridor. And 2 decades ago, you were applying to be here." A pause. "I think you've waited long enough." That night, Elijah accepted the interview. When the CBS crew arrived 2 days later, they were accompanied by 2 assistants, a light kit, a field producer, and a lead anchor, Vanessa Clay, known for her firm but empathetic style. The interview took place in a neutral room in Harvard's Lower East Building. Not too formal, not too cold. Vanessa greeted Elijah with warmth. Her handshake was steady. "I've been waiting to meet you," she said genuinely. The cameras rolled. She asked about the languages. The mop. The rejection letters. His mother. The essay that was ghost-graded in secret. But the question that stilled the room was this: "Do you forgive Harvard?" Elijah's lips parted. For a moment he didn't speak. The crew waited. A boom mic wavered slightly above his head. He answered slowly. "I don't forgive the silence. I don't forgive the gatekeeping. I forgive the individuals who are trying now, even if it's late. But forgiveness doesn't erase what was stolen." Vanessa's eyes didn't flinch. She nodded. The footage cut across the nation that Sunday night. Elijah's voice became the headline: "Forgiveness doesn't erase what was stolen." The internet exploded. Elijah Cross trended on Twitter. TikTok creators reenacted his quotes. One user stitched his line with a historical montage of Black inventors and scholars overlooked in American academia. It crossed 4 million likes in one night. But even as the country hailed him, Harvard's internal politics remained fractured. Lansing was nowhere to be seen during the interview. Sources confirmed she'd quietly taken leave. Faculty listservs leaked screenshots of arguments over departmental restructuring. Elijah's honorary position, though technically granted, had yet to be ratified by a full faculty vote. And in private, others were strategizing, positioning, waiting for him to slip, to become the problem they could point to. Some claimed the media coverage was manipulative. Others insisted it was meritless sensationalism. Still, Elijah taught. Every Tuesday and Thursday night, students packed the basement seminar room. Some weeks, it spilled into the hallway. Word spread that Elijah's class wasn't just about languages, it was about identity, access, the quiet power of learning outside the spotlight. One night as students filtered out, Jada approached him. "They're calling you the Black Socrates on TikTok now," she said, half laughing. Elijah smiled gently. "They don't know how much Socrates bled to be heard." She nodded. "You think Harvard will ever really listen?" Elijah looked at the whiteboard, still faintly marked with a fading red "Teach us." "They're listening now," he said. "The question is, what will they do with what they hear?" As Jada turned to leave, her phone buzzed. She stopped walking, brows furrowed. "You need to see this," she said, showing him the screen. It was a tweet from CBS's executive editor. "Tomorrow night, a national conversation. Elijah Cross goes live with CNN's Crossfire, debating what equity in higher education really means." Elijah stared at the screen. The opposing guest was listed below. Dr. Martin Hale, senior advisor to the Harvard Board of Trustees. The man who once denied Elijah's application, 23 years ago. The studio lights were blinding. Not bright, but blinding. They erased shadows, erased flaws. What remained on camera was pure clarity or absolute exposure. For Elijah Cross, seated across from Dr. Martin Hale on CNN's Crossfire, it was both. They were polar opposites by design. The network knew what it was doing. Elijah, calm, uncredentialed, self-taught, black, in a charcoal button-up and simple wristwatch. Dr. Hale, articulate, suited, manicured, white, with a Harvard pin clipped just under his lapel, and the smug confidence of someone used to controlling the narrative. The host introduced them quickly. Tonight we ask a question shaking institutions across America. What do we owe the overlooked genius? Elijah Cross, the janitor turned linguist, whose Harvard story has gone viral, sits across from Dr. Martin Hale, senior advisor to Harvard's Board of Trustees, and according to records, one of the men who once denied Mr. Cross's admission decades ago. The camera cut to Hale's face. If he flinched, it was microscopic. But Elijah noticed it. The host turned. Mr. Cross, your story has stunned the nation. In your words, what's the real issue here? Elijah didn't blink. He leaned forward slightly. It's not about me, he said. It's about a system that's decided where genius is allowed to come from, and where it's not. The room fell silent. The camera panned slowly across the audience. Activists, professors, alumni, students, all watching with varying levels of discomfort or awe. I'm not exceptional because I taught myself 9 languages, Elijah continued. I'm exceptional because I survived a world that told me I wasn't allowed to learn them. That world includes Harvard. It includes every institution that confuses gatekeeping for standards. Across from him, Hale smiled politely, waiting. Then he struck. With respect, he said, voice even. There's a reason universities have admissions processes, standards, faculty reviews. We can't build education on emotion. We build it on rigor. And who defines rigor? Elijah asked, without missing a beat. The people already inside? The ones who've never had to translate knowledge through hunger, racism, and silence? Hale folded his hands. Everyone faces hardship. Harvard doesn't discriminate. Elijah leaned back now, his voice calm but undeniable. Harvard denied me with perfect scores, perfect essays, and a paper it later used in its curriculum. It did that 3 times. The only thing missing from my file was privilege. A low murmur stirred in the studio. Hale opened his mouth, but the host cut in. Elijah, you've become a national symbol. People are asking how many more Elijahs are there. What do you say to that? He turned to the camera now. Not Hale, not the host, the people. There are thousands, he said, in warehouses, on buses, in janitorial closets. They speak languages no one values, hold truths no one prints. They're told to stay small, quiet, grateful, and they watch doors open for people half as prepared, but twice as connected. The audience stilled. Even the camera crew shifted silently. Genius exists in every zip code, Elijah continued, but access doesn't. It was the quote that would be played again and again. The kind of sentence that doesn't just inform, it wounds. He hadn't raised his voice once, but his clarity thundered. Hale shifted, visibly annoyed now. You can't undermine an entire institution over one case. We've built something extraordinary. You built a castle, Elijah said softly, then trained people to believe that the moat was necessary. It isn't. The host's eyes widened slightly. The metaphor hit hard. Hale raised his hands. If we accept everyone who shows promise without credentials, where does that leave us? Elijah didn't hesitate. It leaves us more honest, more human, less filtered by legacy and more driven by potential. The silence returned. Not awkward, but seismic. You could feel it through the screen. The next morning, Elijah Cross was the #1 trending search term in America. Clips from the show dominated Instagram Reels. TikTok creators chopped and remixed his words. Twitter was split. Some called him revolutionary. Others claimed he was dangerous, undermining standards. Pundits on conservative talk shows labeled him a symbol of woke infiltration, but none could deny the cultural moment. Educators across the country began posting, "How many Elijahs have I missed? What does merit look like outside white norms? Why didn't we see him before the cameras?" The next day, at Harvard, the tension was molten. The president's office received over 2,000 calls in 6 hours. Some alumni threatened to withhold donations. Others pledged matching gifts if Elijah was formally appointed. Students staged a sit-in outside the administration building, carrying signs that read, "He taught us more than your curriculum." Inside the boardroom, behind locked doors and glass walls, the emergency meeting had begun. 15 men and women sat around a walnut table. The mood was divided, and at its center, Harvard's president held a folder thicker than he'd anticipated. The chief of staff leaned over. "There are 2 issues," she whispered. "The backlash and the board." He nodded. Then Dr. Lansing, newly returned from her sudden leave, stood and addressed the room. "With all due respect," she began, "this has become a spectacle. Our academic integrity is under threat. We cannot make policy based on Twitter virality. The head of development leaned forward. Integrity doesn't raise money. This man's story has generated more attention than any of our diversity campaigns in a decade. The dean of admissions cut in. If we back him now, it means acknowledging our failure to see his potential. That invites lawsuits. Silence. Then Hargrove, seated calmly near the end of the table, finally spoke. It's not about backing Elijah, he said. It's about admitting the gate was broken before he arrived. The room was still. Then the president closed the folder slowly. I'm not asking for applause, he said. I'm asking for a vote. The vote was tight. 8-7. The motion passed. But it came with caveats. Elijah would be granted full academic access, a research grant, and guest lecture opportunities, but not a formal tenure-track position. It was Harvard's compromise, visibility without power. Back at Elijah's apartment, his inbox flooded with interview requests, book offers, and a sudden email from the MacArthur Foundation, inquiring about independent intellectual contributions. But he remained grounded. Jada Monroe dropped by with Chinese takeout, and her latest notes. She smiled, half joking. You know you just scared half of academia, right? He grinned. Good. Maybe they'll think twice before locking another door. Then her expression turned serious. What now? He opened his notebook. A blank page stared back. Now, we write our own curriculum. That night, Harvard issued a press release. Harvard University recognizes Mr. Elijah Cross for his extraordinary contributions to independent scholarship. We are proud to offer him the newly established Innovative Minds Fellowship. Polished, diplomatic, careful. But the students saw through it. The next morning, Elijah returned to the campus. As he walked across the courtyard, past reporters and camera flashes, a student stopped him. Sir, she asked softly, do you think the system will change? Elijah paused. It already is, he said. The cracks are how the light gets in. But just as he reached the building, a secretary rushed out with a sealed envelope. Mr. Cross, she said breathlessly. This just arrived. It's urgent. He opened it slowly. Inside was a letter from a law firm. And at the top, class action investigation, discriminatory admissions practices. Plaintiff N1, Elijah Cross. Elijah looked up from the paper, stunned. Students watched him. Reporters waited. And the institution he had once fought to belong to might now be on trial. The air inside the administrative office was climate-controlled, but Elijah felt the chill all the same. He sat at the long glass conference table alone on one side, flanked by empty leather chairs, the fluorescent lights above casting a cold sheen across the polished surface. Across from him sat Harvard's Vice President of Strategic Affairs, Linda Collier, and two members from HR, their notepads open, pens uncapped. The mood wasn't hostile. It was worse. Professional. Linda smiled thinly, folding her hands like a well-practiced diplomat. Mr. Cross, she began, thank you for coming. We appreciate everything you've done to contribute to the broader academic dialogue. Your journey has inspired many, and Harvard would like to formally acknowledge that. Elijah said nothing. He recognized the tone, polished concern wrapped in corporate cadence. It reminded him of every job interview where the rejection letter was already in the mail before the handshake. We're prepared to offer you a title, she continued, public scholar in residence. It's a non-compensated role, symbolic in nature, but prestigious. You'll be allowed to continue using Harvard's facilities for independent study, and may attend public panels by invitation.
No salary, no office, no curriculum, no students.
Just a title, and a muzzle. Elijah raised an eyebrow. Symbolic? Linda's voice didn't waver. We believe symbolism is powerful. We've had to balance internal concerns, faculty unrest, alumni pressure, media exposure. This is the best solution that keeps all parties intact. All parties, Elijah echoed. Except mine. The HR officer beside her cleared her throat and slid a thick folder across the table. Inside legal language, non-disclosure clauses, media guidelines. You'll find the communications clause on page 7, she said coolly. We ask that you refrain from further unsanctioned interviews regarding your time at the university. This will allow Harvard to manage its messaging effectively and avoid unnecessary controversy. Avoid controversy. The phrase sat in Elijah's gut like rusted nails. He flipped through the folder slowly, each page tighter than the last. This wasn't an offer. It was containment. Control. a bureaucratic attempt to neutralize his truth with polished PR. And once again it was dressed up in the language of dignity. Linda leaned forward, voice lower now. Mr. Cross, we've received inquiries from institutions around the country wanting to discuss you, possibly extend invitations. Let's be clear, if this becomes litigious, or if you choose to escalate media involvement, your options will narrow quickly. Elijah looked up, his expression unreadable. So this is a choice, he said. Be quiet and symbolic, or speak and be unemployed. Linda hesitated, then replied carefully, we're offering an elegant solution, for everyone. The room fell silent. In that moment, Elijah remembered a night 16 years ago, mopping the floors outside the same boardroom. A guest lecture had just ended. He'd stopped outside for a second too long, eavesdropping on the tail end of an academic debate in Latin. A senior faculty member caught him listening, narrowed his eyes, and said, "You're in the wrong wing, son. Keep moving." Now here he was, on the other side of the glass. And they still wanted him silent. He closed the folder. "Let me be clear," he said slowly. "You denied me an education. You plagiarized my work. You mocked my position. And when the world finally noticed, you offered me a window without a door. You want me visible, but not powerful." Linda's smile faded slightly. "You want my face, not my voice." He stood. The HR officer began to protest. "You might want to wait." But Elijah was already walking toward the door. As he reached it, he paused. "One more thing," he said without turning. "This room has forgotten what learning looks like when it comes from pain. But the world hasn't, and it's watching now." He left without another word. Back in his apartment, Elijah sat at his small dining table, the folder still unopened beside his cup of cold tea. His inbox was full, more interviews, more appearances, more questions. But it was one message in particular that made him pause. It was from a Harvard teaching assistant. Anonymous. The subject line read, "You should see what they're saying about you internally." Attached were screenshots, emails, Slack threads, internal memos. The tone was unmistakable. "We need to make this story go away, before admission season. Can we offer him something dignified but limiting? He has no credentials. This isn't sustainable." But it was one line that made Elijah's chest tighten. "Once the hype dies, we'll reassign him or phase him out. No one will notice by spring." He stared at the sentence, then at the legal folder, then at the blinking cursor of a new email draft. He began typing. To press at educationwatch.cc Jada Monroe. The Crimson Files. Subject: the truth about Harvard's offer to Elijah Cross. Full internal email chain attached. He attached the screenshots, then, hesitating for only a second, added the entire contract folder they had given him earlier that day. He ended the email with one line: "Visibility is not equity. I am no longer interested in being symbolic." He hit send. What followed in the next 36 hours wasn't just viral. It was seismic. National news outlets picked up the leak. Major journalists tweeted the clause forbidding Elijah from doing interviews. One MSNBC anchor called it the academic version of a gag order. On NPR, a panel of education experts debated whether Harvard's move violated basic principles of intellectual freedom. A protest erupted on campus the next morning. Hundreds of students stood outside the admin building, holding signs that read, "We don't need more symbols. We need systemic change. Silencing a scholar is not equity." Elijah doesn't need Harvard. Harvard needs Elijah. Meanwhile, donors who had publicly supported Elijah threatened to withdraw funds unless the university revoked the contract and issued a public apology. Behind closed doors, Harvard's administration scrambled. The president's office issued a brief, vague statement, calling the situation deeply unfortunate. Linda Collier declined interviews. The HR officer was reportedly placed on administrative leave pending review. Inside the student union, Jada Monroe refreshed her feed every few minutes. She couldn't believe what had unfolded in just over a week. She texted Elijah, "You started an earthquake." He replied with one word, "No. Truth did." That night, a camera crew caught Elijah walking across campus quietly, with a notebook under his arm. When asked what he planned to do next, he simply said, "I'm still teaching, whether Harvard approves or not." He entered a building with no nameplate, descended a stairwell, and vanished into a lecture room that buzzed with students packed shoulder to shoulder. A handwritten sign on the door read, "Unauthorized Knowledge Zone." The students had renamed it themselves. Inside, Elijah stepped to the whiteboard and began writing in Swahili. Below that, in Latin. Below that, in Arabic. Each translation of the same phrase. The door they closed is the one we're opening. As murmurs of the protest echoed outside, Elijah turned to face his students. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. His presence said enough. But even as he began his lecture, his phone vibrated in his coat pocket. It was a new email from a federal education committee. Subject line: Testimony request. Congressional hearing on racial bias in higher ed admissions. Elijah stared at the subject line, his hands steady. For the first time in his life, the system that had silenced him was now asking him to speak on the record, before the nation. The morning air was crisp, charged with urgency. Harvard Yard looked unchanged. Its wrought iron gates, manicured lawns, stately columns, but everything felt different. The tellers of prestige, the keepers of legacy, all watched from behind glass and stone. Today the story changed. Elijah walked toward the main administrative building, his honorary badge clipped to his shirt, but hanging empty. A dozen EDU lens cameras and smartphone operators trailed him at discreet distance. Journalists whispered questions. Students parted to let him pass. The weight of attention felt foreign and painful. Inside, he entered the atrium beneath a glass dome. The marble floor reflected his silhouette, taller now in presence than in stature. He walked up to the reception desk, nodded at security, and continued toward the door that led to administration offices. No one stopped him. He paused, turned to the sea of cameras, smartphones, lenses that framed him like a solo protagonist in a world that had long insisted he be the extra. He held up his badge. He spoke quietly, but the microphones caught every word. This badge has been my access, but not my belonging. He stepped forward. For 20 years I have walked these halls, unseen. I have polished floors where knowledge was spoken over me. I have listened to jokes in languages I mastered. I have watched institutional minds celebrate brilliance, so long as it wore a title or pedigree. The crowd held its breath. Some staff peeked from windows. Harvard's administration, far above him in hidden offices, must have felt tremors. He paused. I accept no promotion for silence, no title to silence my voice. I will not be symbolic. I will not be silenced. He turned, reached behind him, unclipped the badge, and walked toward the exit. Effective immediately, he said as he cleared his throat. I resign my affiliation, my title, my link to any institution that wishes to control the narrative of my work, instead of honoring my voice. He punched the air slightly, as he said resign, not violently, but deliberately. The cameras followed his walk. His steps echoed in the hallway. Students and faculty spilled out into the atrium, parting. Some wept. Many recorded. Elijah pushed open the doors to Harvard Yard. A hush fell as the heavy oak panels swung out. When he stepped out into daylight, the flashbulbs erupted. He didn't slow. Walking toward the gates, he raised his voice so the public microphones caught him. I resign, and if this institution cannot welcome brilliance without trying to contain it, then brilliance will find other halls. He strode out through those gates, as though through a threshold, into new life. Students cheered. Some cried. Alumni cameras flashed. The live feed went viral in seconds. In homes, in dorm rooms, people watched a black janitor, long underestimated, packing away his credentials, rejecting the system that both created and suppressed him. News hosts replayed the clip for hours. Social media lit up. He walked out with dignity. He mopped floors but reshaped institutions. Not a resignation. A revolution. But Elijah's exit was never meant to be an ending. It was a pivot. As he crossed Massachusetts Avenue, leaving Harvard behind, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen. Jada Monroe. He answered, voice firm. I'm walking now. She replied. Soft but urgent. Their live cameras are at the South Boston Public Library. You need to be there. Elijah's eyes narrowed. South Boston? Yes. Someone local tipped me. They said the library needed attention, had been neglected, an archive of community knowledge abandoned. People want you to speak there tonight. Elijah felt a corridor of possibility open. It was less dramatic than Harvard's gates, but it might matter more. He veered off the main road, across a bridge, toward the neglected side of Boston. The neighborhood was a mix of brick row houses, small storefronts, a few shuttered spaces. He parked outside the library, a squat red brick building with cracked masonry and a faded sign, South Boston Public Library, main branch. Inside, the lights were dim. No security. The smell of dust and old paper. Several dozen local residents and students crowded into the reading room. Jada waited there, camera rolling, faces bright with hope. The front desk's wood veneer was cracked, the shelves mostly empty, some vinyl records of local history, some fading periodicals. He stepped in. The crowd fell silent. Jada interviewed a local elder before he spoke. "Mr. Cross," she said, voice echoing. "Why here?" Elijah walked to the center, scanned faces, grandparents, high school kids, community organizers, scholars from local colleges. Some came to see him, some stumbled upon the event. No velvet seats, no lecture podiums, just chairs and thin carpets. "Because institutions cast out what they cannot control," he began. "Because knowledge doesn't belong only to those with titles. Because in places forgotten by power, voices hunger for recognition." He looked across the cracked ceiling, at brick walls that had seen better days. He knelt down beside a dusty shelf with yellowed pages, pulling out an old pamphlet from the 1960s, a civil rights speech printed and left on display. "This place is more than a library," he said quietly. "It holds stories that power erased." He addressed the crowd. "Tonight we'll translate a page from that pamphlet, Spanish, Arabic, French, and make this library speak again." He invited Jada to film higher angles. She switched on her light. In that unheralded room, Elijah paced between scrapbooks, records, portraits. He asked local kids to choose passages. He taught them phonetics. He showed the local history of Black Bostonians, their migrations, their architecture, their languages. He wove their heritage into the broader tapestry of global linguistics. No one asked for his degree. No one demanded credential. They watched him teach, pure raw knowledge in the place that needed it. The audience recorded every phrase, every translation, every emotional pause. And then, as the last sentence echoed, a knock rattled the back door. Someone entered. A Harvard-branded SUV pulled up outside, flashing lights. A hush spread. The door to the library opened again. A man in a tailored suit walked in. A figure in familiar outline. It was Dr. Rebecca Lansing. She swept through the crowd, eyes burning, her expression unreadable. She addressed Elijah in that crowded room, voice surprisingly loud. "Mr. Cross, if you believed leaving Harvard would silence you, you underestimated one thing." The crowd stirred. Elijah straightened. The air sharpened. Lansing continued. "You're still linked to this institution by their legal threat. Do you understand what that means?" Her presence was unexpected. She hadn't just come to challenge him publicly. She'd come to intervene in his moment. Elijah's heart stilled. The library lights flickered. Cameras recorded. The red brick walls shifted in collective tension. Lansing raised a folder, the same one Elijah had leaked, and said, "You've triggered a clause. You resigned on camera, and now Harvard claims you violated your contract. They intend to sue you for breach." The lawsuit never happened. Harvard's legal threat, bluffed in public by Dr. Lansing under the brittle weight of pride, collapsed under the heat of national scrutiny. The next day, a consortium of civil rights attorneys offered Elijah pro bono counsel. By noon, the school's legal team quietly retracted the threat, citing confusion around resignation terms and unintended contractual ambiguity. The cameras had caught it all. The attempt to muzzle, the public intimidation in a community library, that image, Lansing holding a folder as if wielding institutional power like a weapon in a room full of children, was too much even for Harvard's carefully curated image to survive unscathed. But Elijah didn't celebrate. He didn't dance in victory. He didn't hold press conferences or call out names. He returned to work, but not for Harvard. Instead, he began building something that couldn't be taken from him. Rap. It started with a crowdfunding link, quiet, modest, titled, "Help Build a Language Home for the Forgotten." No slogans, no fancy pitch deck. Just a 2-minute video of Elijah standing in front of the South Boston Public Library. "I don't want revenge," he said. "I want repair. I want the next Elijah to be seen before he's 70. Help me create a space where brilliance isn't filtered by wealth, race, or degrees, where literacy is liberation, where every accent is valid, where every kid, every parent, every person who's ever been told they're not academic enough can walk through the door and be welcome." The video was shared 68,000 times in the first 24 hours. By the end of the week, the fund had crossed. People gave everything, from $2 donations, with messages like "for my uncle, who never got to finish school," to $5,000 contributions from anonymous former professors who whispered apologies with their money. Elijah found an old community building on Quincy Street, just 3 blocks from the Red Line, a stone's throw from where he grew up. It had been boarded up for years, once a vocational school, then a youth center, then nothing. He bought it outright. Volunteers showed up within hours. Students who once took his basement lessons now hauled lumber, painted walls, scrubbed floors. One even hand-carved a wooden sign above the front door that read, "The Elijah Cross Language Lab." Inside it was modest. 2 classrooms, 1 recording booth, a mini library of donated books in over 30 languages, and a chalkboard at the front painted the same red as the one from that first secret Harvard seminar. His rules were simple.
No student IDs required.
No fees. Ever.
No question too small.
No voice too broken to be heard. By month's end, they had a waiting list. A 12-year-old girl named Alina, whose mother had cleaned office buildings for 2 decades, stood at the front of the class one Thursday evening. She'd been coming 3 times a week, learning Arabic and Spanish side by side. She cleared her throat and delivered her first full speech, introducing herself and telling her story in 2 languages, back to back. "I want to be a lawyer," she said in Arabic, then again in Spanish, because words protect people, and no one protected my mother when they laughed at her accent. Parents cried. Elijah sat in the back and watched, his eyes wet, but his face still black. News of the lab traveled fast. The Boston Globe featured it, then PBS, then a documentary crew began filming a short segment for American Experience. They called it, "The Man Who Rebuilt Language from the Bottom Floor." Former Harvard students volunteered, some quietly, others openly. A few had graduated with honors, but said they never learned about language the way Elijah taught it. He didn't give lectures. He told stories. He didn't talk at people. He walked with them. He broke down Latin roots next to hip-hop lyrics, compared Shakespearean English to Nigerian pidgin, made Mandarin tones less intimidating by comparing them to music. For every rule he taught, he showed a way it had been used to exclude. Every kid left feeling smarter, not smaller. One afternoon, Jada Monroe arrived with an envelope. "I know it's still early," she said, "but I submitted your name for the National Humanities Medal." Elijah shook his head, smiling. "Let's build the lab first. Medals later." She grinned. "Already built, Professor." The name had stuck. Ew. Then on a rainy Tuesday, something unusual happened. Elijah had just finished teaching a class on tonal migration, how Vietnamese, Yoruba, and Mandarin all used pitch as grammar. The students were filing out when a black sedan pulled up outside. From the back seat stepped a man in his late 60s, well-dressed but understated. No Harvard pin, no entourage. He entered quietly, nodding politely to those around him. Elijah looked up from his desk. "Mr. Cross," the man said, "may I speak with you privately?" They stepped into a side room, barely furnished except for a folding chair and a whiteboard with lesson plans scribbled in chalk. The man introduced himself, William R. Stanton, senior board member at Harvard, formerly silent during the Elijah Cross storm. "I came to apologize," he began. Elijah said nothing. Stanton continued. "I was on the admissions board 23 years ago. I didn't vote on your file, but I saw it. I remember it. I remember thinking it was too perfect, too polished, and I told myself someone helped him write this. A janitor couldn't produce this alone." Elijah's jaw clenched. His silence was louder than anything Stanton could say. "I was wrong," Stanton said. "Many of us were. We let assumptions speak for us. We let image outweigh truth." Elijah finally spoke. "You came to say that in person?" "No," Stanton replied. "I came because the board wants to fund your lab, quietly, if necessary, officially if you'd allow it." Elijah blinked. "You want Harvard money in this room? We want to help." Elijah looked around at the peeling paint, the dog-eared books, the kids running in the next room. "This lab was built by people you ignored," he said. "By parents who can't spell your last name. By students you'd never admit. You want to help? Then show up here. No title, no suit, no cameras. Come teach. Come clean. Come listen." Stanton didn't flinch. "I will." Elijah paused. "Then we'll talk." They shook hands. The door opened. The kids ran in, giggling. Stanton stood to the side and watched as Elijah crouched beside a young boy, struggling with Swahili consonants. The boy looked up, frustrated. Elijah smiled. "It's not hard. It's just different. And different isn't bad. It's beautiful. Say it with me. The boy tried again. Nailed it. Laughter erupted. Stanton's eyes watered. Not from sentiment, but from shame. Needle. Outside, the rain had stopped. The lab buzzed. Across the street, a local mother handed a folded piece of paper to a volunteer. "It's for Mr. Cross," she said shyly. My son drew it. On it, a brown-skinned man, in glasses, standing next to a child at a chalkboard. Above their heads, a rainbow spelled out, "Mr. Elijah makes us smart." That evening, as Elijah locked up the building, he found a manila envelope slipped under the door, no return address. Inside, a handwritten note read, "If Harvard funds you, we'll make sure you never teach again. This time we won't be subtle." The morning after the lab's rain-soaked revelation, the Harvard alumni listserv lit up again, this time with a different tone. The narrative had shifted from contest to negotiation. Elijah wasn't just the anomaly anymore. He was now a potential asset. The university, bruised by national pressure, was recalibrating. In his inbox that afternoon, Elijah found an email from Harvard's Office of Institutional Strategy. The subject line read, "Proposal for Partnership Diversity Fellow Opportunity." He didn't click it right away. Instead, he reread the subject 20 times, paging through mental scenarios. He finally opened it. The email offered a position, Diversity Fellow in Practice, a 1-year fellowship with a stipend, research support, travel funds, media access, invitation to panels, and the implied prestige of Harvard Association. But the document was careful. No explicit apology from the institution, no acknowledgement of past mistakes, no guarantee of tenure or autonomy. It included a detailed media clause. Fellow agrees to coordinate communications through Harvard, is not to make ad hoc statements regarding university policy without prior review. The tone was diplomacy. The message, "We welcome you on our terms." Elijah felt the tug. The lab was resource-rich now, but funds would eventually be tested. A stable stipend, access to research databases, Harvard's brand. These were rare advantages. But at what cost? That evening, he met Jada at the lab. Volunteers polished desks. Children recited phrases in every language they could muster. The place hummed, alive. Jada handed him a printed copy of the proposal. They sat on a worn sofa, jacket sleeves rolled up. "This is Harvard's olive branch," she said gently. "But it's not unconditional." Elijah nodded. "They're offering visibility, not power. They still want to guard the microphone." She frowned. "Does that clause mean they could silence you again?" He looked at the screen of his phone. "Coordinate all public statements through Harvard." Her voice softened. "They want you back on their terms, not yours." He exhaled. "I'll never be silent again. But if I accept, I need full autonomy. I need to be free to speak. If not, I can walk." The next morning, he stood in Harvard Yard again, this time invited for a press conference. Media had been briefed. Harvard welcomes back Mr. Cross in a new role promoting equity and dialogue. Crowds gathered. Students, reporters, cameras, faculty watched from behind windows. The president took the podium. In his speech, he thanked Elijah's lab, called him a bridge builder, referred to past tension as a period of growth. But no apology, only statements of hope. Then he announced, Elijah Cross was being appointed Diversity Fellow in Practice at Harvard, starting the upcoming semester, with duties to advance inclusion and public conversation. The president then gestured to Elijah, who stepped forward to applaud. The cameras shifted to Elijah. He stood composed. The applause warred with his internal silence. He raised his hand, quieting the crowd. "Thank you," he said, voice steady. "I stand before you humbled by the lab's success, inspired by the community's trust, and deeply aware that this moment is not about me, it's about many who remain unseen." Some clapped harder, others watched. He continued, "I accept the fellowship, but not as an honorary decoration. I accept it with conditions. I will speak on my own voice. I will serve with full autonomy. I will not be silenced or shaped for virtue signaling. If Harvard intends to use me as a symbol, then they misunderstand what I represent." The courthouse hush stretched. Then the president nodded slowly. Two administrators beside him exchanged uneasy glances. Then Elijah added, "To prove it, my first act as fellow will be to lead a public symposium at this university on systemic exclusion, and I will invite voices Harvard has refused to hear before." In that moment, cameras captured a subtle shift. Some faculty faces frowned. Eyes flicked to Lansing, who sat just off stage, her lips compressed. Elijah's words seemed to crack the air. The conference concluded. Reporters swarmed him with microphones. Students cheered. Social media exploded. That night Jada called him. "That was fire," she said. He replied, exhausted yet alert. They agreed, but only because they saw they couldn't stop me. But no one foresaw the twist he had prepared. 2 days later, Elijah walked into his lab to find a crate of old tapes and documents. Archives confiscated from Harvard's own linguistics department. Some long forgotten. The crate had a Harvard University Library sticker, but the box was addressed to the Elijah Cross Language Lab. Inside were decades of departmental meeting transcripts, rejected admissions files, internal faculty memos about language funding, correspondence about donor preferences, and grant proposals that had excluded certain applicants for lack of pedigree. Documents that showed how the institution had repeatedly selected against underserved communities, under the guise of academic standards. He scanned one memo, eyes widening. It was dated 1999, written to deny a young black applicant the same scholarship Elijah had once applied for. The language was clear. Support is reserved for candidates from peer institutions, demonstrated publication record, and proper mentorship networks. The message, those without connections would always be filtered out. He looked up at the room full of volunteers and students. They watched him with respect, waiting. Elijah stood, crate in hand, winded in spirit, but resolute. Jada arrived behind him. She gasped softly. "What did you find?" He turned. "Proof Harvard didn't just deny me. They denied many like me, then pretended ignorance. Now they're offering me a title in the same system that suppressed me." He carried the crate to the front. The students gathered round. He opened it, rifled through documents, gasped, scanned a letter, addressed to a black female applicant, in 1987, rejected despite stellar credentials. He held the letter up. The crowd murmured. Elijah said, voice ringing, "This is more than admission bias. It's structural memory. It's archival exclusion. They want me visible, but not in possession of truth. They want me back, but not in power." He looked at Jada. "We'll expose this in the symposium. Harvard wants the optics. I'll deliver the evidence." Jada nodded, tears in her eyes. "They're going to have to answer." That night, Harvard's inbox flooded. The press dubbed it the crate of hidden history. Scholars began citing the materials. Students offered to help digitize them. Legal teams considered FOIA requests. The academic world buzzed. Lansing called a meeting of department heads. The board consulted lawyers. The president issued a statement. Harvard is investigating claims of archival mismanagement. But no denial, no dismissal, no apology yet. Elijah sat in the lab late into the night. Crates open, documents spread, glimmering like buried bones. He thought of every moment he'd been silenced, dismissed, ignored. He realized Harvard had underestimated one thing. When you give someone a platform, sometimes what they carry is evidence. The next morning, a headline broke. Harvard board member Stanton resigns amid leak scandal. And there was a single line beneath. In his resignation letter, "I cannot defend a system I helped conceal." A month later, the morning sky over Boston dawned pale gold, crisp and clear as a promise. In a renovated convention hall just outside the Harvard perimeter, a banner unfurled across the entrance. Voices unheard. A symposium on hidden genius. The language lab volunteers hung smaller signs along the corridors, quoting Elijah, "Genius doesn't wear a suit." Inside, a crowd pulsed with energy. Thousands had registered. Students, parents, community scholars, linguists, teachers, activists, forgotten prodigies. Many wore name tags reading not institutions, but stories. Self-taught mathematician, community translator, street poet in Telugu, and Kiswahili. The air vibrated with anticipation. Reporters roamed, setting tripods, whispering into recorders. National media crews lined the back wall. Backstage, Elijah steadied himself. Jada gave him her eyes, fierce, proud. He'd mapped this moment from the day he first walked out of Harvard. But now it wasn't personal, it was structural. He felt weight, yes, but also clarity. The first speaker was Dr. Lena Wu, a Chinese-American linguist whose work on minority dialects had been rejected by major presses. Her talk on erasure and standard language ideologies made the room tremble. Then came Professor Aminata Diallo, a Senegalese mathematician working in Paris, whose unapologetically visual approach to algebra challenged Western abstractions. Audience applause broke walls. Then Elijah walked to the stage. A hush. He turned slowly to face the crowd. The lights dimmed. A spotlight centered him. He didn't begin with thanks. He began with a statement. Tonight is not a victory lap. It is a reckoning. He paced slowly, scanning faces. We are here to name what has been hidden. Brilliance denied. Opportunities withheld. Voices silenced by protocol dressed as merit. He paused. The murmurs died. He told his story again, not a retelling, but a reclamation. The rejection letters. The ghosted publications. The janitor's uniform. The round table that tried to trap him. The crate of memos. The lab bustling behind him. The leaks. The lawsuit that never was. He spoke with fire but tempered with gravity. Never anger for spectacle. Always anger born of clarity. And then he delivered the keynote. Genius doesn't wear a suit. He built it phrase by phrase. He sketched definitions. Genius is persistence. Genius is being overlooked. Genius is resilient under silence. He called out the myth of meritocracy. He dismantled the myth that credentials equal truth, and recast knowledge as communal, emergent, rooted in struggle. He spotlighted the people the system labeled noise, children speaking two dialects, elders telling ancestral stories, migrant translators, coded speech communities. He projected statistics. How many applications from marginalized zip codes got tossed before review? How many STEM grants went to Ivy-trained applicants? How many journals rejected unknown names? He named names, colleges, journals, donors, without malice, only accountability. He closed with a challenge. Today we reclaim expertise from the towers that built walls. We rip open the archives they hid behind. We demand not just inclusion, but transformation. Let the system be haunted by the very ones it dismissed. The crowd rose in standing ovation. Tears, whispers, cameras panned. The energy felt tectonic. Afterwards, rooms split into breakout panels. Narratives of erasure. Publishing without gatekeepers. Community archives as power. Students stood in lines to talk. Children asked questions. Graduate speakers scribbled notes. In the front row, Elijah saw Dr. Harper Caldwell, his old philosophy professor from undergrad, the one who once dismissed his applications in a tenure committee meeting. Caldwell sat quietly, wiping tears. Elijah's throat clenched. He looked away only briefly. Jada sprang from her seat afterward and joined him across the stage. She whispered, "He's here." Elijah nodded. When the final panel ended, Elijah took the mic again. "Before we close," he said, voice calm but strong, "I invite every institution represented here, every dean, every trustee, every scholar, to stay after and talk to those who have been systemically silenced. Don't come to give platitudes. Come to listen. Come to change." The hall stayed in electric silence. Media crews leaned forward. Faculty advisors shifted uncomfortably. Universities would answer this. They couldn't pretend not to. As he exited the stage, a reporter thrust a mic in his face. "Mr. Cross, what now for Harvard?" He smiled, measured. "Now the work begins. The system doesn't get to ask me to come back on its terms. The terms are being written tonight by many of us together." He walked past dozens of people calling his name, hugging him, thanking him. He stood at the exit doors, the evening light streaming behind him. He turned, scanning the hall one last time. Then someone whispered in his ear, "They've issued a press release. Lansing is suing you for breach of confidentiality." The room froze around him. He blinked. Suing him now. The irony, the timing, the pressure. He squared his shoulders, stepped outside into the night. Cameras flashed. The hall emptied behind him. In the distance, the skyline glowed. The movement he had catalyzed would not recede. As he walked to his car, his phone buzzed with a news alert. Harvard issues statement. All documents in crate alleged fabrications. Board investigates Elijah Cross for falsifying evidence. The rain had finally stopped in Cambridge. The cobblestones glistened like polished glass, and the air held the faint scent of old paper and spring. A year had passed since the conference that shook academia to its foundation. And in that time, Elijah Cross had become both legend and lesson. He wasn't supposed to. Not in their world. Not from where he came from. But the system he had once cleaned from the outside now carried his name inside its walls. Across the country, headlines still echoed his journey. The janitor who rewrote Harvard. from custodian to catalyst. Elijah Cross and the literacy revolution. Harvard, once rigid in its silence, had bent under the weight of public pressure, student protest, and undeniable evidence. After months of investigation, the university's internal audit confirmed what Elijah's crate had revealed. Decades of discriminatory admissions and selective funding policies, favoring legacy students and elite preparatory networks. The revelation hit harder than expected. Alumni distanced themselves. Donors withdrew. The world had seen the receipts, and denial wasn't an option anymore. Finally, on a cloudless June morning, exactly 1 year to the day after Elijah had resigned on camera, the Harvard president stood at a podium facing national media. The seal behind him gleamed, but the man's posture sagged under history's glare. He cleared his throat, voice thin but deliberate. "Today," he said, "Harvard University acknowledges its failures, to Mr. Elijah Cross, and to the many unseen scholars whose voices were dismissed, whose potential was unrecognized, whose brilliance was overlooked. We extend our deepest apology and commit to reforming every policy that made exclusion possible." The crowd erupted not with applause but with silence that felt heavier than noise. That day, for the first time in 86 years of institutional history, Harvard apologized to a janitor, but Elijah didn't attend the ceremony. He watched it from his language lab. A room filled with mismatched chairs, laughter, chalk dust, and the rhythmic hum of discovery. Around him, students read aloud in Swahili, Spanish, and Mandarin. On the walls were hand-painted phrases. Words are bridges. Fluency is freedom. Genius lives everywhere. Jada Monroe sat across from him, typing at her laptop. She had since graduated, now a journalist for The Atlantic, her bylines national. She had written an article titled, "The Cross Effect: How One Man Rebuilt Education from the Bottom Floor." "Do you realize," she said, glancing up, "you're officially in textbooks now?" Elijah smiled faintly. "Textbooks once told me I didn't exist. Funny how they change their mind." Jada laughed, shaking her head. "Kids are quoting you on TikTok. Some of them think you're fictional, like some modern folklore hero." He looked up from his notes, amused. "Good. Let them. Maybe it'll make the next Elijah believe sooner." She nodded. The laughter softened. The children's voices carried through the open door like music. Outside, a mural team was painting the lab's exterior wall. A massive portrait of Elijah surrounded by words in dozens of languages, each translating the same phrase, "Knowledge belongs to everyone." Inside, Elijah was reviewing a lesson plan written by one of his students, a 17-year-old named Marcus, who had once struggled to read. Now Marcus spoke 3 languages fluently and wanted to teach others. "You're ready," Elijah said, handing back the paper. "Start your own class next month. Saturday." Marcus's eyes widened. "You mean teach?" Elijah grinned. "Teach. The best way to prove you've learned." Moments like that were what grounded him. Not the awards, not the media, not the calls from universities offering honorary doctorates. Yes, he accepted some, but only to redirect the funds to his center. Every speech he gave was followed by the same line. "If you want to honor me, fund a classroom in a place you've never been." And they did. Within months, 30 new language centers inspired by his model opened in cities from Detroit to New Orleans, from Oakland to Nairobi. His curriculum, the Cross-Literacy Framework, became a national pilot program in public schools. It emphasized storytelling, bilingual instruction, and cultural context over rote memorization. For the first time, schools taught English and the languages of their neighborhoods. But Elijah remained exactly where he'd always been, at his table surrounded by kids, still wearing the same worn sneakers and faded jacket he'd used to mop Harvard's floors. Every morning, he'd arrive early, unlock the doors, and personally greet each child who walked in, by name. "Morning, Alina. Ready, Marcus? Good to see you, mate." He believed learning began with being seen. Sometimes, when the day ended and the lights dimmed, he'd sit alone, staring out the window at the quiet city. The fame, the reverence. It felt distant. What mattered was here, in the laughter, the chalk dust, the sound of possibility. But history, it seemed, had one more full circle left to complete. Thou. It came as an invitation embossed in gold. Harvard University cordially invites Mr. Elijah Cross to attend the unveiling of the Hall of Educational Reform, featuring his portrait among trailblazers in academic transformation. He almost didn't go. Jada convinced him. "You have to see it," she said. "It's not for them, It's for everyone who ever worked beside a broom and dreamed beyond it. So he went. The day of the unveiling. He walked the familiar path through Harvard Yard. The same bricks, the same air, the same walls that once swallowed him in silence. But now heads turned, not away, but toward him. Students stopped him for photos. Professors shook his hand. Staff whispered his name with quiet respect. The janitorial crew saluted him with a grin. He entered the hall, its marble still gleaming, its light filtered through high windows. Along the far wall hung framed portraits, educators, reformers, visionaries. And in the center, the image showed Elijah standing with his sleeves rolled up, a mop in one hand, a notebook in the other. Behind him, the faint outline of a blackboard filled with words in multiple languages. Underneath, a plaque read, Elijah Cross, 9th Champion of Equity in Education. Knowledge belongs to everyone. He stood there staring for a long time. The weight of everything, the years of invisibility, the mockery, the rejection letters, the silence collapsed quietly into that single frame. Behind him, a tour group entered. Students stopped to stare. One of them, a freshman carrying a heavy backpack, leaned to his friend and whispered, "That's him, the janitor who rewrote the rules." Elijah heard. He turned, smiled softly. "No," he said. "The people rewrote them. I just reminded the world where the pen was." The students nodded, awed. He walked out slowly, past the portraits, through the same corridors where he'd once pushed a cleaning cart. Every tile, every corner felt like memory. Outside, under the ancient oak trees, Jada was waiting, camera in hand. "So," she asked, "does it feel full circle?" Elijah looked back at the building. The sun hit his portrait through the window pane, reflecting on the marble floor. "Full circle," he murmured. "No. Circles close. This is a door opening." He adjusted his old jacket, the same one from his custodial days, and started down the steps toward the yard. The wind carried the faint sound of children's laughter from the direction of his lab. For the first time in his life, Harvard's bells rang, and he didn't feel like an outsider listening. Inside the hall beneath his portrait, a small brass plaque had been newly added overnight. It read simply, "Former janitors, custodians, and service workers of Harvard. This is for you." And beneath it, a blank line waited, ready for the next name. No one should have to prove their worth just to be treated with dignity. But stories like this happen every day. Quietly, cruelly, without apology. If this story made you feel something, don't let it fade. Type yes if you believe in justice. Subscribe if this broke your heart.